Moving on to talk a little bit about Latinx and Chicanx identity. One of the things you've seen with labeling in recent years is the dropping of the gendering, right, of Latino and Chicano, Chicana, Latina, and going with the X on the end of the name to give more awareness to transgenderism and the idea of gender in general not really being very relevant. So, again, this is just a new sort of updating of how we use the labels now. So again, the more old school Latino, Latina is now being, sort of replaced with the X on the end of the name. So just to give some context there. I wanted to talk about Guillermo Gomez Pena and Coco Fusco in relationship to Latin identity and Chicano identity. Because to me, as a group, they're just really intriguing to look at. They used to work together as a group, as a pair, and then later on in their career, they decided to work separately, right? So you can look at their career, right, as a pair, a couple, right, even though they were never romantically involved, and then later separately. They do these projects where they're trying to sort of dig into people's stereotypes or people's sort of racism, might we say, on things Latin or things Chicana, and trying to expose them for what they are. The prejudices, right? The misconceptions. One of the most famous projects was the Undiscovered Amerindians project, where they literally went around to these museums basically in a cage and were presenting themselves as this undiscovered tribe. And what they found was, most people didn't question this. So it was this idea of if you have dark skin, right, somehow you're more primitive. They found that most people didn't question this. We call this othering, you know, that we look at these people as the other, they're outside of us. And so we're allowed to think of them as lesser or more primitive and such. We talked about primitivism at the beginning of the 20th century. So, you can think back to that conversation. Obviously, this is a pretty racist way of thinking, but they said they were shocked that nobody really would sometimes challenge this. And they gave clues. I gave you a video so you could watch them in action, and you can see there's clues. There's things like a book on Christopher Columbus, or them watching TV, doing things that obviously like indigenous natives wouldn't do. But yet at the same time, people would come and gawk at them, and sometimes they'd ask questions, but not really, right? Or they'd ask the wrong questions. Another project that they did was called the Temple of the Confessions, where they dressed up like Catholic saints, because Catholicism is the primary sort of Christianity within the Latin community. And they were in these boxes, and they would let people confess to them their fears or their stereotypes or their prejudices about Latin people. And they said they were shocked by what people will tell you when they don't think they're being judged, right? Or they're free, right, to say the things inside of them. And they were like, we wanted to record this and sort of let people know what people think about, minorities when they're allowed to say it, right? Where they have no repercussions of saying it. Here are some shots from Amerindians where one of the guards is feeding Guillermo Gomez Pena. She's wearing a wrestling mask. So again, there's clues in their performance, right, about what they're getting at. Gomez Pena has gone on to do a lot with Chicano history or what he calls revisionist history. And on the left, you have his crucifixion project, where he questions, right, the role of Christianity, especially Catholicism, within Latin communities and Chicano communities. And then his Mad Mex project, which I think is an interesting sort of mix of Latin, sort of identity and technology, right? So he's kind of playing with different things. He's very famous for doing performance art education and projects and symposiums. One of the projects that he does is he calls it inverting the racial pyramid, where he'll go to a school to teach performance art, and when he's teaching the class, he'll actually invert the racial pyramid, as he puts it. So he'll call on black men first, black women second, Latin men next, Latin women next, and then white women, white men last, right? So white men are last. And he says it's surprising, but not surprising at the end of the project, where he says usually the white men go and complain to somebody about how they were treated. And he's like, well, you just saw my whole point about, how I often feel that people of color are treated. So his stuff is challenging. and it makes you have to sort of think about your own perspective on it, I suppose. Here's Coco Fusco doing one of her works, and I gave you a link out to her website. It's obviously the most comprehensive place to go to see what she's doing right now. And this is one of her earlier pieces called Chavala Realty, where she posed as Queen Isabella of Spain and was giving people the rights to land. Now, why is this pretty fun? You'll know she's wearing a ship as a hat, and she's sort of dressed up in this, Queen Isabella garment. Well, Queen Isabella was the Queen of Spain when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and and funded his project. So, this idea of a European nation setting out to the Americas, right? And then claiming American land. And it's, this idea of selling off land that you don't own. How do you own this? It contrasts the European approach to owning something and the American approach of, just not sort of just living on the land. Native Americans were like, well, you can't own the land. And Europeans were like, watch us, right? So she's, again, sort of challenging that notion. But again, you can go to her website and look at a lot of her pieces. We can look at artists who deal with Native American identity. One of my favorites is Quick to See Smith. And with her name, you'll know she uses her tribal name, Quick to See, and then also her Christianized name, Smith. A lot of tribes during the Indian removal times, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the Trail of Tears thereafter, tribes were told they could stay in their location if they Christianized. So if you ever wonder where people get these, Europeanized names, it's because their tribe probably decided to Christianize in order to stay on their land. So she's using both her tribal name and the Christianized name, which again speaks a bit to Native American heritage. Her works, like the one you see here, Trade, often deal with stereotypes, how Native American imagery gets pulled into contemporary pop culture. In this work, you'll notice you have the painting on the bottom with the canoe and various sort of ad imagery kind of laced into the painting. And then above that, you have licensed sports memorabilia, right, that uses Native American imagery. FSU, the Seminoles, were well aware of this, very familiar with this. And she's questioning, like, why would you want to use this stuff? And then the idea of trade, how it used to be like trading beads and blankets and such, and now it's trading off of Native American imagery. So she kind of plays with this idea of what's for sale and what's being traded and what's been sold. She does maps where she'll replace imagery with tribal imagery or replace the names of the states with tribal names, as a way of, again, kind of making you think about the issues of Native American identity and what's been sort of bulldozed or absorbed within European culture itself. Asian identity, I always sort of try to frame this through Tomoko Sawada, who I think is a really interesting artist. She's Japanese. She started out as a young artist using photo booths, like you see here, where she would go into a photo booth and then she would do different looks, in a sense, kind of questioning, like, well, who are we really anyway? And then when she got a dealer and kind of more money to work with, she started playing with a more advanced idea on this, where she wears wigs and different outfits and such. She reminds me a lot of Cindy Sherman. This idea of using yourself as a template to explore stereotypical looks. I always think of the Harajuku girl fads of the early 2000s on the left, and then the tanning fad that went around in the Asian community with the blue eyeshadow. So she's kind of playing with this, or the idea of geisha, sex kitten. So she plays a lot with, like, are you who your clothes say you are? So again, kind of the Cindy Sherman kind of view on this. And I always leave you with the question of, like, well, what is identity anyway? I used to do a project in my classes, and sometimes I still do it, but I found that it sometimes got people worked up. So I kind of backed away from it for a while, where I'd ask people to come in basically dressed up as sort of a stereotype of something. So the girl on the right, Sasha, she was sort of a military girl, right? And so she tried to dress up as the opposite. She said, I tried to be as girly as possible. The middle girl, basically student, was from down in Miami, had Latin background, and said, she was sort of interested in the chonga, or the chola kind of subculture of the sort of sexy Latin woman. And so she said, that's not how I dress, that's not how I act. So she dressed up kind of as the sexy Latina, I guess. And she said it was interesting to see people's reactions to that and how it reframed how people approached her and talked to her. And why I used to do this project was to have people think about inhabiting someone else's skin. Maybe somebody, especially that you judge, right? And trying to sort of operate as that person and think about how would you deal if you were that person. And that project that I used to do with my students quite a bit was born out of someone like Nikki S. Lee's photographs, where she basically does these identity projects, as she calls them, where she infiltrates communities and poses within the community and operates within it in order to, in a sense, figure out what their dynamics are. So she's always posing within them as a legitimate member of the community, and then trying to, in a sense, absorb their customs, their culture, without being noticed. And she said that most of the time, because she's trying to play by the rules of the game, she says that she was not ferreted out. Like, nobody understood that she wasn't supposed to be there. And if you think of something like the Schoolgirl Project, she was quite older than these kids, but she's able to, in a sense, infiltrate. Or in the Seniors Project, quite younger than the seniors she was living with. And so she was like, what is identity anyway if it can be so easily transmuted just through costuming and presentation, plus knowing the rules of the group that you're playing within, right? Knowing the rules of the group that you're becoming a member of. And she said it was insightful to think about how much she learned about people, but then she said some people found out about some of these projects, like her Hispanic project, for instance, and sort of said, well, is this appropriate, right, to ethnically try to traverse, right? She's Korean. That's Nikki S. Lee's background. So is it appropriate for her to try to transcend? Her hip hop project probably got the biggest blowback for whether it's blackface, essentially. And I think these are legitimate questions that have to be asked. Is this okay? Is this learning? Or is this cultural appropriation? And is this something dangerous, right? Or something that's volatile, but again, I think that she opened up a space that was interesting about, like, what is identity anyway? And I always finalize my talk with Mollison's Disciples projects, where he goes around to various groups and photographs people who dress up like other people. And in a sense, like, why do we sometimes, take on the identity of somebody famous? What problems do we have with just being ourselves? But he's like, again, if you look at these groups of disciples, essentially, they feel more comfortable wearing someone else's skin or identity. And what does that say about identity again at all, right? If you just feel more comfortable being Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, or Elvis, right? What does that in the end really say about identity?